Dr. Ian Miller is Washington Sea Grant's Coastal Hazard Specialist. He currently works out of Peninsula College in Port Angeles, Washington. Ian collaborates with coastal communities and public agencies on the Olympic Peninsula to strengthen their ability to plan for and manage coastal hazards. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Marine Ecology from Western Washington University and a PhD in Ocean Sciences from the University of California, Santa Cruz. His graduate research focused on tonight's topic. So with that, I am going to turn it over to you, Ian. I'll mute myself and you can take over.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me confirm first that you all can hear me, maybe just with a nod or a thumbs up or something like that.
We see you and we see your screen.
Great. Yeah, and my screen's visible. Well, thank you so much for having me tonight. You know, I think there's a lot of downsides of COVID, but one of the upsides is we've all just gotten better at this kind of remote meeting, and it's allowed me to be with you tonight. And so I'm very thankful for that. My name is Ian Miller. I work for what's called the Washington Sea Grant Program, which is a University of Washington-based program. It's what we call an extension program. My understanding is that there are not really equivalents in Canada, interestingly enough, but we really are sort of intended to translate and bring marine sciences to communities to assist them with managing any number of sort of marine associated challenges they might face. I work in the area of hazards. My research background, though, is in coastal ecology and coastal geomorphology, and it's those kind of research backgrounds that are going to feature heavily in tonight's talk. I'm based in Port Angeles, Washington, so sort of central on the Strait of Juan de Fuca and just east of the mouth of the Elwha River. And if anyone has not had the chance to come over here and check out the river or other areas around here, I hope you have the chance to do so. The Coho has re-established its runs across the strait connecting Victoria to Port Angeles. So that opens up the chance to visit again, hopefully soon. I know for me, it's been far too long since I've had a chance to set foot in British Columbia. Couple of things before I get going. One is that if there's any chat questions, I'm not going to really be following that. So maybe Joan or Denis, you can just sort of chime in if anything comes up as we go along, and I'd be fine with sort of stopping, or we can wait till the end and take questions and discuss. Either way is fine with me. I wanted to also note that I am trained as a scientist. I do have some data plots in the talk. For those of you that are data averse, I apologize, but I'm going to try to sort of make sure that we have plenty of time to talk through them and sort of get at what they are intended to convey. I also have a good number of videos in this presentation, and my hope is they play well, you know, across the tenuous internet connection that we may have over this landscape. And so I just wanted to note that. One thing I'm going to do once I get started here is I'm going to turn off my video just to try to preserve as much bandwidth for the presentation videos as possible. And then I'll turn it on at the end. And then just sort of the last thing I wanted to just sort of say is that this is really a story. I know there's a lot of conversation about fish, and salmon in particular were a major feature of and still are a major feature of the Elwha restoration. It's not something I study, though. I do have a number of colleagues and friends that focus on fish, and hearing the conversation in advance made me wish that I'd thrown in a few of their insights, but we can certainly talk and have questions at the end about fish. What I focus on in here, though, is changes and evolutions in the coastal landscape and the coastal community, the coastal ecosystem associated with dam removal. So with that introduction, let's go ahead and dive in. And again, I'm just going to stop my video there. I just wanted first to note on this slide that you're looking up the river from the river mouth shown here. So this sort of water body here is a Strait of Juan de Fuca, and then the mouth of the river looking up into the Olympic Mountains. I also just wanted to draw your attention to the large number of names that are on this slide along with mine. And one of the really interesting features of this project from my standpoint as a scientist was just the large number of really engaged and passionate collaborators. Really unique project in that way, who came from a whole variety of institutions and programs and backgrounds, and really, really intriguing project from the standpoint of the collaboration. Okay, so just to make sure everyone's oriented geographically, we are talking about the Elwha River, which again empties into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. It flows from south to north into the strait. It's only about 110 kilometers long or so. So it is a very relatively small, short and steep river. But it is one of the bigger rivers on what we call the Olympic Peninsula, which is this peninsula that I live on, and is what you stare at, if you're looking across the water from Seattle or the San Juan Islands or Victoria. And these red dots, or red lines rather, across the river mark the locations of what used to be the two dams that sat on this river. And there are photographs shown of those two dams at left here. This one that I'm circling with my mouse was the lower of the two. It sat at about river kilometer 8 or 9. And then the one below it, the Glines Canyon Dam, was the larger of the two, at least in terms of height. It was built in 1925. And this one sat at about, river kilometer 30 or so, somewhere around there. This upper older dam, what's referred to as the Elwha Dam, was built earlier. It was built or completed rather in 1911. Both of these dams are now gone. So these, and I've got a couple views that'll show you what these two locations look like. But I wanted to just also point out that I've titled this the Elwha Laboratory, only to emphasize that one of the really interesting things about this project was its scale. The landscape scale of the restoration was pretty unique. And we didn't have a lot of templates to look to try to predict what we might expect in terms of the ecosystem response, either terrestrial, in the river, or in the coastal environment associated with dam removal. So in a way, the whole project was an ecosystem experiment. So a bit more geography, just to orient you with what I view as my study area. And again, my interests are primarily in the coast. So here again is the Elwha River. And a couple of sort of place names that I may use throughout today's talk. First, I would note Freshwater Bay, which is this little embayment to the west of the river mouth, what I refer to as the river mouth, or the Elwha River mouth, that I pointed to earlier. And then this protuberance into the strait, I'll refer to as the delta, the Elwha River Delta. To the east of the Elwha River Delta is a stretch of shoreline that's a bluff-backed section of shoreline, so we refer to that as the Elwha Bluffs. And then finally, Eddy's Hook, which is the feature that protects and creates Port Angeles Harbor. For those of you that have taken the Coho from Victoria, this is what you round as you're coming into Port Angeles. This is a sandspit formed in part by sediment delivered from the Elwha River. And it is also the end of what we refer to as the Elwha drift cell, this kind of concept associated with sediment movement along the shoreline in the Strait of Juan de Fuca from west to east. And I've provided this red arrow to kind of reference that concept of sediment movement along the shoreline being predominantly west to east. So Eddy's Hook is formed in part of that process. So the questions that we started with when we were thinking about the dam removal, and playing in the background here is a time lapse, basically a year-long time lapse of the removal of the lower of the two dams, the Elwha Dam. Again, this one sat at about river mile 8 or so. How will the dam removal change the nearshore environment? When I use that term nearshore, I'm talking about the shallow coastal environment. It's the sunlit zone of the coastal world. It's or what you would technically refer to as the euphotic zone. both physically, so how will the landscape evolve, and ecologically? If so, how quickly? Are the changes persistent? Those are the sorts of questions we were asking prior to dam removal, and we're continuing to ask to this day as we continue to track the evolution of both the landscape and the ecosystem in response to dam removal and other drivers. By the way, I'm going to move away from this video, but this is available on YouTube. So I would direct you there if you're interested in sort of seeing the mechanics of how they actually pulled these two dams down. So one of the you know, it's sort of, we're talking about two dams here that sat well upriver from the river mouth, and it's worth asking, well, what's the connection? What's the mechanism by which we would expect and hypothesize that there would be coastal changes, both to the landscape and to the ecosystem associated with these dams? And of course, the answer to that is that both of them stored sediment in deltas formed in the reservoirs that were formed by dam emplacement. And so this is a photograph looking downriver. So the river mouth sits just behind this hill slope over here. And this was taken in early 2011. So just before dam removal started in September of 2011. And here the reservoir has been lowered slightly. There was a few feet of lowering that preceded dam removal. And you can clearly see this extensive lake delta representing, in this case, 100 years of stored watershed sediment delivery that was trapped in that reservoir. And the expectation was that when the dams were removed, those deltas, both this one that you can see the photograph of and the upriver delta associated with the Glines Canyon Dam, would start to erode and transfer some portion of this sediment down to the coastal environment, changing the landscape and having a variety of ecosystem influences. And that is exactly what happened. So as promised, to try to convey this to you, I'm going to use this interesting data figure. I'm going to show you a couple versions of it and highlight just a few different things. But this is a sediment budget that is intended to convey to you the amount and the timing of movements of sediment from different parts of the watershed into the coastal environment. So the thickness of the band is proportional to the mass of sediment that moved from different sources. So if you just start at the bottom here, you can see this was the estimated upstream sediment supply, 1.2 million metric tons during the 5-year period from 2011 to 2016. So basically what we think of as the 5-year dam removal period. Then you've got the largest mass coming from erosion of the Lake Mills Delta. And then you've got this substantial mass coming from erosion of the Lake Aldwell Delta, which is the one that I showed you in that photograph previously. So these are sources of the erosion of these two reservoirs were the primary source of sediment to the river in the 5 years of dam removal. And then we've got some losses here. Sediment was deposited both in the main stem of the river and on the floodplain. Some of it is still there, but pretty small quantities relative to the total. And I would note just down here at the coast, we see that most of the sediment eroded from the two reservoirs ended up down at the coast. Some of it that's represented by this marine dispersal number, 13.1 million metric tons, is what we refer to as dispersed. And essentially what that means is we cannot find it. This is probably mostly mud and silt, fine sediment that's easily entrained in the relatively energetic waters of the strait and dispersed widely. Whereas about 5.4 million metric tons, we can find. Most of it still sits right near the river mouth, and I'll show you a couple pictures of that. But that's the largest sort of mass of material that we can find, again, that used to sit in those two reservoirs. These bar charts over here are intended to convey when this material was in motion. So down here at the very bottom, there are years written here. These are water years, so they run from fall. So the water year 2012, for example, would be fall of 2011 to the fall of 2012. And you'll note here that the biggest bar for each of these sits in water year 2013. So the other interesting thing about this removal is that most of this sediment moved very rapidly, it really in the second year of dam removal. So just to highlight a couple of things. So one thing that's not represented on here is, hey, what was the total? What was the total mass stored in those two reservoirs? It was 30 million metric tons. So about 65% of that total mobilized and moved down the river in that 5-year period between September 2011 and October 2016. So that suggests that 35% of it is still there. That is true. There are still some remaining deposits in the two reservoirs that probably will persist for quite a long time. They're sort of configured as things like terraces that are well above the reach of the river, and so probably will persist. And then again, just most of that material was rapidly transferred to the coast. And again, most of that happened in 2013 and 2014. Now, during that time period, in this 2013 and 2014 time period, what we refer to as sediment flux, or sort of the rate of sediment movement from the river into the coastal environment, was about 70 times what we estimate the background rate to be. So the Elwha River during this time period was behaving more like something like the Skagit River, one of the bigger rivers that empties, well, the biggest river that empties into Puget Sound, and one of the bigger rivers that empties into the Salish Sea. So sometimes I refer to the Elwha in this time period as a little river with a big river complex. So it was acting like a big river in this time period. Okay, so what were the consequences of that sediment budget that I just showed you? So one of the most obvious ones in that 2013 to 14 time period is a more or less persistent turbid plume. This is a photograph again looking up the river mouth. This was in April of 2012, and you can hopefully readily see this very turbid plume. Now, you know, this is what rivers look like typically during flood events like the one that we had, you know, just a couple of weeks ago. So this is not at all atypical to see in the rivers of the Salish Sea. But what made it interesting and unique is that this river was turbid pretty much year round in this time period. And that had some really significant ecological influences that we'll see later. The coarser sediment, the sand and gravel that was moved by the river and deposited in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, created a pretty substantial new estuarine and freshwater marsh habitat around the river mouth. And so this is a 2009 aerial photograph. Here's that river mouth prior to dam removal. And in 2018, you can see this extensive new habitat feature formed here. It totals roughly, what would it be? Well, I apologize for flipping around on units, but about 70 to 80 acres. And this is both sort of estuarine and freshwater marsh habitat primarily. And then some of that material moved along shore in that longshore drift or a longshore transport system that I referenced earlier. So this is a photograph, July 2013, looking up the beach at a location that's roughly a kilometer to the east of the river mouth. And so you can get a sense here for how coarse the beach was at this site. And then by June of 2018, that same site looked dramatically different as the sand eroded from those reservoirs, deposited at the river mouth, was entrained in the alongshore system and moved to the east. And we now can sort of confidently say that we can see the influences of the dam removal as far away as Eddy's Hook, which is over 6 miles distant from the river mouth. And this was one of the big questions at the outset of the project is, would we see any influence on Eddy's Hook, which again is at what we refer to as the distal end of the drift cell. And it took about 6 years to get there, but we see the influence mostly in terms, and by the way, these are again 2 photos looking up the beach. Eddy's Hook is now sort of a rip-wrapped kind of defensive structure, again used to protect the harbor. So these are rocks placed by the Army Corps of Engineers. And you can get a sense for how coarse the beach was on Eddy's Hook. And then this is a July 2018 photo of the same location. Again, the riprap boulders are here, but you can see how much finer the beach face is associated with that dam removal sediment moving along the shoreline. And then finally, some of the material ended up on the seafloor. And this is a map view of the Elwha River mouth. Again, here's the river mouth right here. And the colors on this map are elevation change in meters, in this case between 2011 and 2016. So really sort of during dam removal, how much did the elevation of the surface change because of sediment deposition? And this dark red, that's over 5 meters of sediment deposition. That is that river mouth, a photograph that I showed you earlier, this new estuary and freshwater marsh. But you can see these kind of thinner deposits both to the east and west of the river mouth. Those are subtidal, those are underwater, and also figure heavily in some of the ecosystem changes that I'll describe in a little bit. Here's another perspective on that deposition on the seafloor, kind of what does it actually look like? So this is my first go at showing videos, so hopefully they're coming through. There's 2 videos playing here side by side, but they are of the same exact location on the seafloor. Let me go back to that. And this particular location on the seafloor is about 500 meters east of the river mouth at a depth of about 8 meters or so. And this is a pre-dam removal look at what the seafloor looked like, very coarse enough to support the growth of algae and kelp. And then in the summer of 2015, you can see that it's become essentially a sandy seafloor with some significant ecosystem consequences as well that we'll get into. Okay, so with that kind of perspective on some of the physical changes associated with this dam removal, let's move on to this question, do these physical changes result in ecological change? And I'm going to focus, and the study that I'm involved with focuses on this shallow subtidal zone. So, we're talking about depths of maybe from 5 to 30 meters, well, less than that, probably 5 to 25 meter sites. These are all sites where the seafloor gets enough sunlight to support the growth of kelps and algae. And, generally characterized by sort of the suite of organisms you'd expect to see in most any sort of shallow subtidal ecosystem in the Salish Sea. And our hypothesis going into the project was that we would go through these kind of series of phases that each would have some sort of ecological consequences associated with them. So our pre-dam removal sort of conceptual model was we have a coarse seafloor, clear water. That coarse seafloor supports a lot of kelp growth. And then things that are associated with kelp do well in this system. During removal, the first thing that would happen is we'd have lots of turbidity because of fine sediment in the water. And so that would create cloudier water with presumably some kind of ecosystem impact associated with that. But then we would have deposition on the seafloor represented in this panel C, associated with the distribution and dispersal of coarser sediment as the dam removal proceeded. And then our post-removal situation would be clear water again as that turbidity cleared up, and then a sort of persistently altered seafloor that would drive changes to the community that could use this system because the sort of assumption we made was that the organisms that we see using this system are dependent upon the type of substrate on the seafloor. Now, if you sort of thinking back to the map that I showed you, this persistent deposition on the seafloor did happen, but not across the entire system. only in a few small areas. And so that was a major feature that factors into the results that I'm going to show you. But despite that, we still saw some really interesting things happening in the shallow subtidal ecosystem. So to sort of study those ecosystem effects, we decided to use a SCUBA-based monitoring system or a SCUBA-based investigation to actually get onto the seafloor and count and quantify what lived there at sites scattered across the system. So to do that, we formed what we refer to as an interagency dive team, only because we pulled together divers who work for a bunch of different entities. It's led by what's called the U.S. Geological Survey, which, despite the name, has a variety of ecologists that work for them. And then we had divers from the lower Elwha Clallam tribe. And I should have mentioned at the outset that the mouth of the river and much of the delta is the reservation and the traditional lands of the lower Elwha Clallam tribe. So they have a significant interest in the resources in this offshore area. Myself from Sea Grant, again, University of Washington, and then we were occasionally joined by a dive team from the United States Environmental Protection Agency as well. And what we did, the system that we set up was to set up a series of what we thought of as semi-permanent sites that we wanted to try to revisit through the dam removal. So up here in the upper right is a map in which the shoreline is just shown with a line. So again, here's Eddy's Hook, here's the Elwha Delta, and each of these blue dots is a site that we set up. So we had kind of paired sites sort of stretched around the delta. We also set up two, what we refer to as control sites. We wanted to have two sites, and those are at a distance of 30 or 40 kilometers from the Elwha. And we wanted to set those up in a place that we were pretty assured would not have any sediment influences from the Elwha whatsoever, so we could use them to understand potentially other drivers of variability in the community using the shallow subtidal. And that each of those sites was marked by what we called a center post, which was just a metal rod in the bottom. You can see a picture here. And then 50 meters east and 50 meters west of that center post were two cement blocks that formed the end of our transect. So we had a center post and then a 50-meter transect, or a 50-meter length to the east, a 50-meter length to the west. And then 30 meters of that 50 was our measurement transect, sort of the 30 meters in the middle. And basically, in that 30-meter length, we would roll out a tape and do what we call a swath survey. And the fundamental idea behind a swath survey is that we have some set width from our tape that we're rolling out, in which we are counting and identifying all of the invertebrates greater than 2.5 centimeters, all of the algae or kelps greater than 11 centimeters, any benthic fishes that we see and observe, and then also we make measurements and observations about the sorts of sediments that are on the seafloor. So what we get at the end of it, and there's a data sheet sort of showing you kind of how we keep track of what we're seeing on the seafloor as we go along. And the key thing is that when we get to the end, we have a known area that we have quantified. In our case, typically a 30-meter long transect that is 1 meter wide. So we've sampled 30 square meters. So what we can then do is we can quickly for every transect to calculate a density of particular species that we're interested in or groups of species. And that is our key sort of metric that we use to identify patterns through time, was the density of invertebrates, density of algae, density of fishes on the seafloor. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is just to give you sort of a big picture look at what sort of these sites look like. You've already gotten some sense from that from the video that I showed you previously, but I'm going to show you a site that we call H2 because we're really bad at naming things. This is a site that's about 2 kilometers east of the river mouth, marked with this yellow star here. Here's the river mouth right here. And I'm just going to play this video. This one was shot this summer. And so the first thing you'll see here is this tape that we stretch out over that 50-meter long distance between our center post and our end pyramid. And then this is just a video that I'm collecting as I swim along the transect with the camera pointed straight down. We just collect these because it allows us to get a big picture sense for change at the site. We can use it if we think we've missed something, we can go back and use this as a reference. But the key thing I want you to note here is just overall what this particular site looks like. You know, it's a fairly dense kelp site, lots of good kelp growth, cobbly bottom. Kelp find lots of stuff to attach to here and grow on. Generally, again, this particular part of the strait is great kelp growing territory. Okay, just by way of comparison, same exact site. This is though in 2014. So again, data sheet, and then you should see the tape. And again, same exact idea where we're just swimming that camera along the seafloor. But here, hopefully you've sort of quickly noticed a major difference between you know, this last summer's seafloor and the 2014 seafloor. And again, 2014 was really in just the midst of the dam removal time period, in which we don't see any kelp at this site, or very, very little kelp at this site. So let's focus first on the kelp story. So I'm using this term kelps generally. Oftentimes in our area, when people use that term, they think immediately of bull kelp, but we're actually using it to reference 9 or 10 species that we frequently see at these sites. They're shown here. Many of these are probably familiar to you if you do any wandering along the seashore, because most of them wash up with some degree of frequency. Here is bull kelp, Nereocystis leuciana, and then there's a whole variety of other species that we see now. Most of these are not buoyant surface kelps like bull kelp is. Most of these are non-buoyant kelps that are sort of right on the bottom. So when they are abundant at a site, it gives it a very, we refer to them as salad bowls, and there is a lot of that at the Elwha. Okay, so again, as promised, I'm going to try to convey some of this using data, and we're going to look at the density, average density of kelps at our Elwha sites, at those 15 sites that I showed you around the Elwha Delta. So the overall average of all sites, and the and down on the bottom, you can see time 2011 through 2020. And then here again, we're dealing with density. So the number of individual kelp, I'm going to call them plants, but they are not plants, per meter square of seafloor. And you can see before dam removal, again, a very kelp-rich site, so 5 per meter squared. Again, that's the average across the system. So very kelpy. Kelp like it here. So again, just to drive that point home, here's another video of a site in which you can get a sense for that density of kelps. Okay, during dam removal, we had massive declines of kelp. Densities declined by 80% or more in the 3 years, you know, after dam removal started, 2012, 2013, 2014. I should note, by the way, as well, that we always survey in the summertime. So this is a summertime project, which is the kelp growing season. Most of our kelps are annual. And so we see, you know, optimal conditions for growth in July and August, and that's when we are out there surveying. So massive declines of kelp during dam removal. So what's going on here? It's probably obvious based on what I've told you before, but this is just to drive this point home, this is a video. Indeed, what it's showing there is a video, and I'm going to pause it. This was collected at a depth of about 6 meters. So at a fairly shallow depth. Whoops, sorry, that was unintended. At a site, right there at the Elwha Delta in May of 2012. This is during the daytime. And so hopefully what you can make out here is that you can see flashlights that divers are holding. You can occasionally maybe see a hand or another feature, but this is in the middle of the day. It is dark. And so this is associated with that turbidity during the peak of dam removal, and it diminished light dramatically. And in fact, we had a University of Washington graduate student, Hannah Glover, who wanted to actually sort of take a more rigorous approach to figuring out if this was indeed a culprit for the decline in kelp during dam removal. And she applied some modeling to some turbidity data and found indeed that during those years of dam removal, that kelp did not have adequate light to support growth. Now, we also had, again, a fundamentally different seafloor in a few limited locations. So again, we had this seafloor transition from a coarse seafloor to a fine sediment seafloor, only at sites right near the river mouth. So I've kind of circled them with this red line here. Now, each of these circles is one of our dive sites. These values here, I don't want you to focus on them, but they're mean grain sizes in millimeters. So basically sand to mud. And I'm sorry, I take that back, in phi units, which is an awkward thing that geomorphologists use. And so dark red is, I'm sorry, I take it back. These are millimeters. The key thing though to note here is that you can see that fining of the sediment from the pre-dam removal situation to the 3 years after, both in the color, but I've also circled the ones that transitioned into that finer sediment. Kelp don't grow in these conditions because they don't have anything to hold on to support their growth. So that also influenced that decline. Okay, so what happened after dam removal ended? So if we start to look, dam removal ended more or less in 2015. Kind of depends how you measure it, what you call the end, but the dams were both more or less fully removed, especially from the standpoint of sediment, of holding back any sediment by late 2014. And indeed, by 2015, we saw kelp start to recover almost immediately, but at lower densities than before dam removal. So this very rapid recovery after dam removal was something that we did not know would occur, but it's one of the major themes of dam removal. It's something that many of you were referencing in the conversation that you were having before I started. Just this idea that the ecosystem has this ability to fairly quickly respond to this kind of restoration event. And so we see it here with kelp. Dam removal ended, the turbidity that sort of had been a feature of the dam removal period quickly cleared up. Kelp responded rapidly to that. Density started climbing year after year. Now, I've just jumped from the Elwha to those control sites that I referenced earlier. And I do this to note that what we're starting to realize is that there's more to the story of what happened at kelp in this, to kelp in this system than just dam removal. So this is the average kelp density at those two control sites that are distant from the Elwha that we use, again, to assess, are there other things going on in this system? And you'll note that in that 2014 to 16 time period at the control site, even as density is increasing at the Elwha, it's declining at our control sites. So that's led us to hypothesize that recovery could have been faster at the Elwha, but maybe there was something else during this time period suppressing kelp growth. And it turns out that we think there are potentially two culprits, both things that you've probably heard about previously. One is sea star wasting disease or sea star wasting syndrome, which hit our study area in 2014, was first observed in some locations on the coast of Washington in 2013. And the photographs that you're looking here are ones that we took at our study sites, typically in 2014 and 15, in which we are seeing, stars wasting before our eyes, basically. So sea star wasting syndrome just leads to sudden and rather gruesome death for many species of sea star. And one of the hardest hit species in our studies areas is a species that many of you are probably familiar with. It's the sunflower star. It's this one. It's also this one, but you can't really tell that very well. And these are voracious predators. They will eat bivalves, they will eat urchins. They are fast for a sea star, and they're very effective predators. So one of the things that we hypothesize for our sites, and has also been documented elsewhere, is that one of the consequences of sea star wasting disease is that their prey flourished after they were hit so hard by disease. So what you're seeing here is some data that was assembled by an undergraduate student at the University of Washington last year. Basically just looked at urchin density. This is sea urchin density from our sites relative to sea star density, which is in purple. So here we see this major decline in sea star density associated with sea star wasting disease, and a sort of an associated increase in the density of urchins, which again, sunflower stars eat, but urchins also eat kelp. And so we think that this is one of the relationships that may have led to suppressed kelp recovery at our sites after dam removal. More urchins, more kelp predators in the system. The other big one that, that we know is at play here is what has been referred to in the media as the blob. You all probably have heard of this. This was a massive pool of warm water in the Northeast Pacific in the 2014-2015 time period that made its way into the Salish Sea starting in 2015, and has been associated with kelp suppression in other parts of the West Coast. And so our data support the idea that the blob may have played some role in suppressing kelp at the Elwha. So now that both of those things have passed, or I should say, now that they are diminished a little bit, we still see suppressed sea star densities at the Elwha, but we do see maybe something that's possibly approaching more of a full recovery as we move into the more recent years, again, with some variability. And I would also just remind you that we're averaging all our Elwha sites here, some of which no longer support kelp at all because they were covered with sand and mud. And so we might expect that our overall average density would be slight bit lower. Okay, so that's enough about kelp, at least for the moment. Let's turn our attention to the invertebrates, which is another thing that the other thing that we sort of primarily focus on. And the density of invertebrates, like most Salish Sea shallow subtidal ecosystems, is pretty phenomenal at these sites. We see a pretty large number of species and genera. So this is a sort of a gallery of many of the sort of most common invertebrates that we see at these sites, and you'll probably recognize a lot of these. I won't go through them all. But we'll sort of feature and focus on a couple of them in the slides ahead here. Now, I need to apologize for these slides at the outset. They're not quite as well developed as the kelp ones, but I want to walk you through them. So here we only have our invertebrate data worked up really for the dam removal period. So what you're going to see on these plots is fewer years of data, pre-dam removal, 2012, 13, and 14, but the same exact thing where we've got density, just like I presented for kelp in, density of invertebrates per square meter of seafloor, but you're also going to see the number of taxa, the number of different species that we observe on average at our sites, just as another metric that we can use to assess if and how a community is changing. Now, we had hypothesized that somehow the invertebrate community at this site would be linked to kelp. Again, because kelp is so successful here, we thought, hey, the invertebrates that live in this site must somehow be sort of associated with or connected to that kelp in some way, shape, or form. So we expected once the kelp started to diminish, that we would see the invertebrate community change or diminish in some way, shape, or form. That is not what happened. Largely, the invertebrates seemed to shrug off dam removal. So you'll note here, we see either stable or increasing density of invertebrates through time at most of our sites. The number of taxa are also relatively stable. These different colors are divided spatially. So to the west and east of the river mouth, right near the river mouth, and then the green are our control sites. But again, overall, the picture is invertebrates really didn't seem to care too much about dam removal, which to me is somehow satisfying in the sense that, there's a lot of ways in which dam removal has taught us something useful about the resilience of ecosystems to perturbations. There were some exceptions. So organisms that were very tightly coupled to kelp did indeed lose out associated with dam removal. So here is a beautiful little stalked jelly. Before I started diving at Elwha, I didn't even know these things existed, and they are extraordinary, but they attach only to particular species of red algae. And so during dam removal, we did not observe these. They were more or less gone from the system. We don't actually quantify kelp encrusting bryozoan, but they also became very rare because the kelp they used for substrate were also largely absent from the system. By contrast, some things really seem to do quite well during dam removal. So this is probably my favorite invertebrate, the feather dust, large feather duster worm, Udistylia vancouveri. So you sometimes see these at low tide, but they can be pretty prolific in the shallow subtidal environment. These are quite large. They can be 20 centimeters or more in terms of this tube length. And here, this is a bar plot of the density of these worms at a set of sites to the west of the river mouth. The green bars are what we saw at Elwha. The red bars are what we saw at our control sites. And so hopefully what you see here is this picture of, hey, these things did really well at the Elwha through dam removal, even as at the control sites, their densities went down, suggesting that maybe those were overall bad years for this species. But at Elwha, they did well. And we think that for some organisms like these, either they did well because they are mechanically disturbed by kelp. There's so much kelp here that's attached to the bottom and swinging around in the current that things like this are probably just constantly getting hit. And so we thought, hey, maybe they sort of lost that mechanical disturbance. They also may have found more food in the water because not only was sediment coming down the river, but there was 100 years of stored organic material that was being eroded out of the reservoirs. That being said, if we look at filter feeders overall, things that, like the tube worms, that pull their food out of the water, we don't see much of an indication that filter feeders as a whole did exceptionally well. They seem to just sort of continue on through the dam removal. And so this is, again, some data that was put together by an undergraduate student at the University of Washington. And the red line here is the suspended sediment load from the river. So the sediment load from the river during and after dam removal. So you see the big spike during dam removal. And then what she did is she just looked at the density of all of the filter feeders together. So these would be things like bivalves, tube worms, things that are extracting material from the water. She had hypothesized that during dam removal, she would see a spike in the density of filter feeders because there's more food in the water column. But like the invertebrate story in general, filter feeders just seem to sort of not care one way or the other about dam removal. And then how about the fish story? The fish story in sum is more or less very similar to that of invertebrates. They were sort of either fairly stable or increasing through time. It's worth noting that our dive-based methods aren't great at assessing fish patterns, but generally this story is similar for those that we used other methodologies like seining to try to assess how fish responded to dam removal. But like the invertebrates, species that were very closely aligned with kelp. So for example, kelp greenling, which are shown in this photograph here, or silver spot sculpin, things that are just really sort of like linked to kelp in some way. Those species did diminish in the system during dam removal, but fish overall did not. And in fact, there were some really interesting stories associated with fish and the dam removal. And the video that I'm showing you here, I'm going to pause it while I talk you through this, and then I'll show it to you again. The video that I'm showing you here is at one of those sites that went, oh man, I'm sorry. One of those sites that went from being cobbly to sandy. So again, this happened at just a couple of sites. But again, at these sites, we had maybe 50 centimeters of sand deposited on top of a formerly cobbly substrate. Those sites used to support kelp, no longer did. At those sites, though, other creatures moved in very rapidly, and one of my favorites and one of the things that was most encouraging to see were sand lanch, which are a small forage fish, one of the many forage fish that's of significant management concern in the Salish Sea because they are a prime food source for salmon. And so I'm going to start this, oh gosh, having all sorts of problems here. I'm going to start this video again. And basically what this is us trying to capture these sand lance. And these are really interesting fish because they actually burrow into sandy substrates and use it for protection. And as in this video, you can see these sand lance just jetting out of this sand, this newly deposited sand as we swim along it. So that was an instance in which those species moved in and utilized that newly created habitat, typically within months of it being created. The other species that did this really effectively was Dungeness crab, which many of us know and perhaps enjoy as a food. And so it was also very nice to see a species like that moving in, utilizing these new habitats and thriving due to dam removal. So I wanted to say thank you. A couple of sort of key points here. The dam removal did indeed change the physical structure, and it's still different in places. Ecological communities also responded, though some of those changes associated with kelp, for example, were not persistent and are oftentimes muddled due to other things that were happening, like disease in the system. Kelp density was, kelp was the big loser during dam removal. And in fact, that book that was referenced in the conversation before I started, Elwha Reborn, the author of that book is a Seattle Times writer, and she coined a term during dam removal that caught on. She said, hey, this is a kelp-ocalypse. And people started to think of dam removal as being this kind of significant ecosystem detriment. But in fact, not surprisingly, we saw kelp, quickly rebound immediately after dam removal ended. And then sort of a note about resilience, invertebrates and fish largely seem to shrug off dam removal, though there were some individual species that were winners and losers. within those broad groupings. So a couple of acknowledgements, and then I just also want you to point you to my email at the bottom. If there's anything we don't get to in the discussion or conversation that we have time for, please feel free to email me and I'd love to follow up. And with that, I'm going to restart my video. And thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Ian. That was a really sort of broad look at everything that happens when something as seemingly catastrophic as a dam comes down. So I know in BC there have been times where we've seen dams come down without it being planned,
right?
And you know, sort of the catastrophic failure of a dam, but not, we don't have any that I believe anyways that would be going directly into a marine environment. So yeah, really a very interesting perspective.
Yeah, you know, that's a great point. And the other thing I'll note is that we believe that we can also use, you know, what we've learned about the response of the shallow subtidal ecosystem to dam removal as a bit of a template for understanding other perturbations to the system. So just by way of example, many of you were probably, you know, around this summer when we had the heat wave in June that corresponded with some of the lowest low tides of the year. And that was a significant stressor for a variety of lower intertidal organisms that, you know, they as individuals had certainly never experienced anything like that. And it's quite possible that, you know, that their genetic lineage hadn't experienced anything like that ever. So it was a really significant and anomalous event, led to the death of you know, numerous species and large numbers of lower intertidal invertebrates. But one of the things that sort of gave me hope through that was just seeing what we saw at Elwha and the ability of these systems to rebound rapidly if conditions allow. And so, you know, as I walked the beach in a variety of locations after that event and saw, you know, sort of the death and destruction associated with it, I had a little bit of hope because of what I was able to observe here at the Elwha.
Well, it's sort of interesting that you mentioned that, because we will be having a talk about that in March, but also that in your talk you referenced the sea star wasting disease, because we had a talk last week from, you might be familiar with him, Dr. Jason Hoden from Friday Harbor Labs, talking about this exact thing and how they're sort of experimenting with bringing them back. So it was nice to see these tie-ins for other topics as well. So I'm going to go to a couple of questions in the chat here for you. From Jason, is asking, have you seen any increase in shorebird or coastal bird use in the changed habitat?
The answer is almost certainly yes, but unfortunately, we don't really have the data to support that. No one was really measuring shorebirds. It was a big gap. We knew it was a big gap, but we just didn't have anyone that was able to put together a monitoring program for them. You know, anecdotally, we definitely see more and different shorebirds utilizing the nearshore environment after dam removal. You know, species that oftentimes people point to as new to the system are things like oyster catchers, which is interesting because, again, as I pointed out, generally the intertidal where oyster catchers forage at the Elwha now is pretty sandy, whereas formerly it used to be pretty cobbly and coarse. And generally I would associate that cobbly coarse habitat as maybe being better for oyster catchers, but for whatever reason, they've decided they like it better. Definitely harlequins, and the gull populations exploded. That we're, you know, not clear why that might be. It could be because the other thing that sort of fish related, the other positive from dam removal is that there have been some positive responses for salmonids. The adult population is rebounding, but more slowly than many of us had hoped. But what there has been a really dramatic and significant increase in is production of smolts, which presumably things like gulls would feed on pretty readily. And so I've often wondered if the increase in the population of gulls using sort of the estuary of the Elwha is associated with the increased abundance of salmon and smelts and other small fish using that system. Just a guess though, but definitely bird changes and marine mammals as well for that matter.
Yeah, I would think that some of those birds that depend on the sandlands a lot for food might have also seen some positives from that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you know, we don't have the data to really link them specifically, but anecdotally, you know, I frequently see sort of your expected cast of characters, things like grebes and cormorants, right over those kind of sand deposits that I know support those sandlands, right? Which makes a ton of sense. They know they're there, and they're certainly utilizing that food source.
Oh, wonderful. David Grigg asked, did the Elwha tribe notice a reduction in shellfish and crab? And if so, how did the state of Washington respond to that?
That's a good question. And I'm assuming, I don't know if the sort of question is sort of before dam removal or after dam removal. So I guess there was no reduction, and in fact, there was an increase. Now, before dam removal started, there was concerns amongst fisheries managers that the dam removal was going to be, you know, catastrophic, was I think the way people were thinking of it in the shallow sub-tidal. So they did permit some emergency harvests of things like urchins, sea cucumbers, and geoduck, you know, the commercially important invertebrates that occurred, you know, in the years kind of before dam removal. However, you know, as I kind of alluded to, during and after dam removal, if anything, populations of both bivalves and certainly crabs increased in at our sites. You know, crab I just kind of alluded to in the sense that crab moved in and started utilizing those sandy substrates along with the sandlands. And the tribal crabbers immediately caught on to that. In fact, so quickly that oftentimes we used the location of their pots to sort of determine where there was sand when we were out there sort of diving or working. So it was actually astonishing to me how quickly the tribal fishermen sort of figured out where the seafloor had changed, and they put their pots there, and that's where they would harvest Dungeness crab. And similarly, geoduck appeared to do quite well through dam removal. In fact, some of the locations where I talked a bit about locations where sand deposited, but at a few of our sites, it was really mud. So a layer of mud was laid down on the seafloor that in places was up to 1 meter thick. And at those sites, we did think that things like geoduck would not be able to persist through that, but they did. And in fact, we saw increases in density of shellfish at some of those sites. So, you know, shellfish seem to be doing quite well. And I can't say for certain that there's been any commercial I'm not sure if the tribe has permitted any commercial harvest of geoduck at some of the sites closest to the Elwha in the years after dam removal. But I'm sure that day is coming because their populations are doing quite well.
All right, great, thank you. Jennifer Getzinger is asking, were there any brachiopods?
We do not see brachiopods at these sites.
Okay. Eliana.
And let me just make sure so brachiopods are I think what people refer to as lamp shells, which are quite common at some, especially I think I'm more accustomed to seeing them at maybe deeper sites like in the San Juans, but we don't see them at the Elwha.
Okay. Aliana is asking if you could go back to the slide listing all the species of kelp. There was one
Absolutely.
there that had 9 species.
Here, let me try to do it maybe more quickly. Make sure I got them right.
I think that's the one probably that
Yeah.
she would be looking for. So while we're looking at that slide, Jason asked, are you surveying anything inside the new sediment habitat?
That is a great question. Also something that we really missed, that we couldn't figure out how to do effectively. And a lot of that was because, again, before dam removal, this was a pretty much across the board with a few exceptions. Most of our sites were very cobbly. And, you know, we just couldn't work out an effective way to sample the infauna in those cobbly substrates. It certainly would be possible to do it. And in fact, we've done just a little bit of reconnaissance infaunal sampling in some of those sites that became muddy, just to sort of see what sort of, if there was a community that was recruiting into those freshly laid down muddy substrates, and the answer is yes, but nothing quantitative and nothing comprehensive. So the other point that I'll make there is, and I've sort of mentioned this twice, where, you know, there's just a lot of things that we missed. And one of the really challenging things about essentially a landscape scale experiment like this is you spend a lot of time being anxious about what what are the most important things to measure, and then sort of cross-referencing that against what is feasible to measure, given, you know, the skills and expertise, the people that are available and the resources that you have, and all that kind of thing. And so, you know, you're missing things. Oftentimes, you know them, you're missing something at the outset, and you just don't have any way to deal with it. And that was the case for infaunal sampling. We talked about it a lot. We wanted to do it, but we just couldn't figure out a feasible way to make it happen.
Okay, well, it looks like you did a lot of sampling and covered a lot of things. So obviously there will always be something that didn't get done. Teresa was asking, can you clarify the timeline for dam removal? Am I correct that the lower dam was on the upper river? Which dam was removed first? Were they dismantling both simultaneously, or did they complete one before starting the other?
That is a great question, and something I probably should have run through in a little more detail, because it is pretty important. Both of them were started and progressed simultaneously. So both of them, the first chunks were removed in September of 2011. The lower dam, the Elwha Dam, the one that I showed the time lapse of, and let me just go back to that, because we maybe can let it run here while I talk. So this is the lower of the two dams, the Elwha Dam. This one was the older of the two. So started in September 2011. This one came out rather quickly. So it was pretty much fully complete by April of 2012. So it really took, 6 or 7 months to get this dam more or less fully removed. Now there was still stuff that had to happen to the site and all that kind of thing, but in terms of getting out the stuff that was blocking fish and sediment movement, it was really quick, which was a bit of a surprise, because this dam was the older of the two and it was pretty poorly built. And so there was a lot of concern that the process of removal might lead to some unintended failure somewhere. But this one actually came out pretty smoothly. The upper dam took quite a bit longer because it was built better. And so it was just a bigger ordeal to take it apart. So that one, again, started in September 2011. And it wasn't fully removed. Let's see, I want to make sure. I can't recall if the final chunks were blasted out. I think it wasn't until 2015 that really the last bits of it came out. Now, from a fish and a sediment standpoint, I think the completion date is probably more in 2014. Like what was left wasn't really inhibiting fish or sediment movement, at least as I understand it. But I think really sort of the final blasting occurred in 2015. So it took substantially longer.
So the dam that was the really tall dam, that was the one that was upstream.
That was upstream. Yep. River Mile. Gosh, River Mile must have been like, well, River Kilometer 20, something along those lines, if I'm recalling correctly.
So by the time it completely came out, the lower one was already gone. So the sediment from it wasn't going to get caught behind the lower dam.
Correct. Yes. Yes. Although interestingly enough, you know, in that sediment budget I showed you, I sort of quickly referenced like, hey, some of the sediment that was eroded from the reservoirs, a little bit of it didn't make it to the coast. A little bit of it ended up in the main channel or in the floodplains. Some of it's still there. So what happened is the lower dam came out, that reservoir started to erode, and then the upper dam sort of came out a little bit more slowly. And also because that dam was higher in the watershed, it had trapped more sand and gravel than the lower dam. You know, it basically caught most of the sand and gravel that the watershed produced, and such that what made it down to the lower dam was more of the finer material that could sort of be in suspension in the river. And so when the upper dam started passing sediment, a lot of it was coarser sand and gravel, and that kind of smeared on top of the lower reservoir. So, you know, the lower reservoir eroded and then got covered again with a thin layer of sand and gravel. And some of that is still there. Like, you know, when you walk around on that former reservoir surface, you're walking on mostly sand and gravel that came from the upper reservoir.
Sheila, go ahead. I see you've got your hand up.
Understanding how complicated it was to see everything during your transects, that sort of thing. And also on the assumption that because the dams had been there for such a long period of time, I'm assuming there were mussels, freshwater mussels growing in the sediments. Was there any indication of that in the sense that when all the water came flowing out, were any freshwater shells perchance seen anywhere along the shoreline? I mean, this is a bit of a stretch, but it's just kind of interesting to see.
Yeah. So my understanding is that there are freshwater mussels in the river, in the Elwha River. And I believe that actually there was some kind of effort to maybe move them to locations that were thought to be maybe less impacted by the dam removal. I'm not so sure about that. But generally we don't see their shells either on the beach or, you know, in the shallow subtidal. And in fact, I have never seen a freshwater mussel in the Elwha. I don't spend much time in the river, so.
Maybe up further upstream or something like that.
Yeah, but I know they are there.
Yeah, okay, so just also, did you mention, if so, I've forgotten, the approximate depth of the reservoir?
Oh, you know, that's, yeah.
Either one.
I didn't mention that, and I don't know the numbers exactly. I know that they were, you know, away from the delta in kind of the main body of the reservoir.
Yeah.
Both of them were pretty deep, and really probably the best for the upper reservoir was deeper and the dam was taller. You know, the upper dam was over 200 feet tall.
Oh, right.
And so, you know, the reservoir would have been near that depth. And then the lower dam was somewhere around 100 100+ feet. And so, you know, the lower parts of that reservoir were probably close to that depth.
Right, good. Okay, thank you.
Just going back to the questions in the chat, Jason says he did not see any macrocystis on the kelp photos.
Right.
Was it there?
Macrocystis, so is interesting because we know it's in the system because we see it floating around, but we have never seen a live attached macrocystis at any of our sites. So, and I should say, let me clarify, I guess. We have seen it from our boat attached to the bottom. So we know it's growing in the system, but never in our sites and not in significant quantities.
Right. We're getting a lot of comments that people are saying it was fascinating and really informative. Cynthia also would like to know, where did the impetus for removing the dams come from?
Well, that's also a great question and something I probably should have touched on. Yeah, the story of the removal of these dams is really interesting and long and engaged. It's told pretty well in that book, The Elwha Reborn, that was referenced earlier by Linda Mapes. How, you know, in short, there's a couple kind of important elements. One is that the lower dam, the one the time lapse that's up on the screen here, that was built in 1911, and it was never licensed by the federal government. So hydroelectric dams in the United States are licensed, and this one was never licensed. The upper dam was built in 1925, and it was a licensed hydroelectric dam when it was built, and that there is a 50-year relicensing process for those dams. So every 50 years, they have to go through a relicensing a process that allows for sort of public comment and public engagement as part of that process. So starting in the mid-70s, when relicensing efforts for the upper dam started, there started to be these whispers, as I understand it. I wasn't around at the time, but you know, sort of these kind of subversive sort of comments about, hey, maybe we should be thinking about removing these dams. You know, at that time, as I understand it, fairly quiet, but some additional context was that the lower dam, as I mentioned, was poorly built. In fact, as it was being constructed and the reservoir was filled for the first time in 1910, it blew out and generated a flood that almost, you know, led to catastrophic loss of life for people living along the lower river. And so the sort of safety of that dam was always a bit in question. And then the other important context is that when the lower dam was built in 1911, oh, thank you. Yeah, the title of Linda Mapes' book is in the chat, which is great. The Washington State, even at that time, had a law in the books that salmon passage was required for dams. But the lower Elwha Dam was never built with salmon passage. And in fact, the person that sort of spearheaded the construction of the dam, who was a local Olympic Peninsula booster, Thomas Aldwell, he was able to convince the fisheries managers of the day to allow him to get around that law by building what would have been, as I understand it, one of the first fish hatcheries built in Washington State. So that was built, a fish hatchery was built at the base of the dam. Fish hatchery failed, it never worked well, but the lower dam never had fish passage. So that relicensing process, as I understand it, focused a lot on actually on getting the lower dam licensed. And that involved safety upgrades, that involved trying to figure out fish passage. And as I understand it, basically just both of those issues sort of were increasingly problematic and difficult, especially providing fish passage around those dams. And sort of as that relicensing process kind of rolled along over years and decades even, just this idea of removing the dams gained steam, especially amongst environmental groups, and then supported by the lower Elwha Clallam tribe, who were a steadfast supporter of dam removal from the earliest years of the relicensing process. And so eventually, and this is kind of part of the story that I don't fully understand how it happened, but Congress, the US Congress got involved in a way that they typically don't in, individual river systems. And so that led to the passage of the Elwha Restoration Act in 1994, if I recall correctly. And that act basically required the restoration of the Elwha River. So again, how we got from relicensing to sort of Congress passing a Elwha specific law, I don't know the details there. But once Congress passed that act, that kicked off basically 15 years of a process to determine, can you restore this river without removing these dams? And the conclusion of that question was no. The dams have to come out in order for, this law passed by Congress to be satisfied. So that eventually happened after, many years of then subsequent sort of political wrangling. It finally happened in 2011.
On sort of a related thing, Nigel was wondering, where did the money come from to take apart the two dams?
The money came from the US Treasury. It was, congressionally appropriated funds. So also fairly unique in the sense that most dam removals that have happened in the United States have been privately funded or have been funded with, restoration dollars, but this came straight from the US Treasury.
Oh, okay. My husband here had a couple of, they're sort of related. He said your baseline was pre-dam removal. Was there any data pre-dam construction?
Great question. Also something that I probably should have mentioned. So the answer broadly speaking is no. We had very little insight about what this system looked like before dam emplacement. There were two significant exceptions to that. Well, maybe not significant. There were two exceptions to that we really relied on heavily. In terms of understanding the historical shoreline, we had a 1908 coast survey map and associated notes. So, 1908 would have been before the lower dam was finished, but after it was started, after construction was started. And the thing about, so that told us sort of roughly where the shoreline was and a little bit about what it looked like. They marked things on the map like, gravelly or notes like that sort of on the map. So it told us a little bit about what that system looked like before dam removal. But that was about it. And we, the coast survey was congressionally sort of required survey of US coastlines and was conducted with varying degrees of rigor throughout the country. And one thing that was never clear was how much we could rely on, the details of the map, the exact position of the shoreline or that kind of thing. The other thing that we had that probably from an ecological standpoint was our most important resource was a 1914 kelp survey that was conducted by a University of Washington faculty member to support potash production. So I don't know much about potash or what it's used for. Many of you probably have a better sense. But my understanding was that around that time, there was some loss of an international source of potash for, I think, for cement production. I'm not totally sure about that. Oh yeah, there's a nice reference to a book about Tom Aldwell west of here in the chat. So this person went out and basically surveyed the entirety of Washington State's coastal waters and basically just marked out where kelp beds were. And so that was a really important resource for us, because knowing where kelp beds are tells you, one, that kelp, and this was all bull kelp, just surface kelp, right? It was conducted from a boat. It tells you obviously that kelp were in the system, tells you roughly how extensive they were. And most importantly, from our standpoint, if there's a kelp bed, we know something about the bottom. We know something about what the substrate are like on the bottom, and also the depth. So that was a really important resource to have. But again, 1914, so it actually did not predate dam removal, but we thought it was it probably told us something useful about pre-dam removal conditions. Other than that, not a whole lot.
So not even indigenous knowledge or?
We definitely had some indigenous, we had some stories about, well, we had stories mostly about, I guess, that conveyed the importance of the system. Nothing that conveyed to us a lot of detail about what the system was like. There's one thing I'll mention just because I found it so interesting. There was this kind of notion that prior to dam removal, or prior to dam emplacement rather, people, Klallam tribal members would have harvested clams off of the intertidal beach. Mm-hmm. So there were these stories of clam harvest occurring on the intertidal beach. So I got really interested in this because this was when I was a graduate student, and I thought, hey, if that's true, that tells us something really useful about what the substrate of the beach used to be, because clams are typically tied to certain types of substrates. But when I actually dug into it and tried to find a documentable, sort of well-cited source for that story, I couldn't find it. And what I eventually concluded was that it was just sort of, kind of like an urban legend, something that people just kept telling to each other. And I couldn't actually find who originally told the story. What I could find, though, were well-documented accounts of people picking up clams on the beach after storms. So getting this kind of like storm-delivered bounty to the shore. And that is something that we see occur at Elwha. We saw it before dam removal, because bivalves are plentiful in the shallow subtidal. I didn't really sort of convey this with the data I showed you, but some of the sites that we go to are absolutely loaded with bivalves of various species. And it's not at all a stretch to imagine that storms, excavate some of those, erode the substrates, excavate them, throw them up on the beach. We see it occur now. And that would have been a pretty, that when that happened, that probably was a pretty exciting thing to have occur. And you would have definitely made use of that as a food resource prior to dam emplacement. So though that particular story was well documented.
Do you expect the nearshore to revert eventually to what it had been, like all the areas that are sediment covered over, like the sort of the cobble now? Do you think it will eventually erode back to the cobble?
That's a great question. And I think that if you had asked me a couple of years ago, I would have said yes, but there's no indication that that's happening. We're still going out to these sites. We still kind of measure the thickness of the sediment, and largely they've been pretty stable in the last 6 years or so. I guess I'd have to answer, I don't know at this stage.
Sheila, did you have your hand up for a question, or was it not put down?
Yeah, just a quick one. Given that these two dams, it was age and safety and no hatchery, more or less, is the state of Washington going to continue with dismantling any more dams?
Well, it's interesting to note that, the state of Washington wasn't necessarily, can't be attributed to the removal of these dams, right? These were removed by essentially an act of Congress. And so, however, there are other dams that have been intentionally removed in Washington, including some larger hydroelectric dams. And I do expect that we will continue to see an increasing number of dams come down. Often I do a lot of work with undergraduate students, and I certainly frame it as, you know, this is something that some of you could make a career out of if you want. The fact of the matter is that dams are infrastructure. Infrastructure does not last forever. And, you know, in most instances, you can't, you know, it's far easier and cheaper to intentionally remove a dam than it is to let it fail. So, you know, so dam removal is a growing concern. And I think will be in Washington and will be elsewhere in the country.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting. Thank you. Thank you.
I don't see any other questions in the chat right now. I did want to ask you, do you still have your blog?
I do, yes.
Oh, okay, so I might not get up there in the chat in time, but you can follow Ian online at the Coast Nerd Gazette blog. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Yep. Coastnerd.blogspot.com.
Maybe you want to type it into the chat.
I will type it into the chat.
Like that.
Yep. And yeah, I still maintain that. You know, there's I guess a little less Elwha now than there was in 2014 or so, but all coastal issues, you know, typically associated with Washington or the Salish Sea, or you know, sort of our coastal waters.
And these dams weren't removed because of danger to downstream populations. It had nothing to do with that, right?
Well, I wouldn't say that it had nothing to do with that. Again, that lower dam was pretty poorly built. And there was always some level of concern about the safety of that dam. I wouldn't characterize it as a key sort of reason that it was removed, but it played a role. You know, part of the licensing of hydroelectric dams in the United States has to do with dam safety. And so, you know, dams have to get that 50-year license, they have to, you know, people have to feel comfortable about the safety of those dams. And with the lower dam, I think that there was always a degree of uncertainty about how viable that dam was.
Okay. And just quickly, have different species of salmon returned? Yeah,
we didn't even get to talk about the fish, which is somehow satisfying for me because I get asked about fish all the time. So the answer is yes. It's worth pointing out that the Elwha supported most species of salmon with the dams in place, just at pretty diminished numbers, with a few populations extirpated, notably like the spring Chinook that were sort of the famous large Chinook in the Elwha were extirpated by dams. But, you know, there's some really encouraging early signs from salmon. I think this was mentioned in the conversation before. I think at this stage, all of the species that you would expect to utilize the upper watershed have done so. They've all been documented past the upper dam site, right? So that was one of the key things, is like, hey, if we take these dams out, are fish going to be able to find their way up? You know, is there going to be something left that maybe continues to block their path? Is the river going to change so much that they actually can't navigate it? But all the species that you would expect to use the upper watershed have been documented, including some Chinook salmon utilizing the far upper reaches of the watershed. So that's all very encouraging. The only things that are carefully monitored for adult returns are Chinook and steelhead. Both of them are increasing, but still low, right? Still below the, you know, still well below the expected capacity. So for example, I think the expectation for Chinook is that the Elwha can probably support on the order of, if I'm recalling correctly, you know, tens of thousands of returning adult Chinook, whereas I think the average in 2020, or the number returning in 2020 was, I think, around 6,000 to 8,000, if I recall correctly, you know, in the thousands, which is more than the average for the decade before dam removal, started was around 4,000 per year that were spawning in the river, adults returning. So an increase relative to that baseline, but still well below the expected kind of full recovery threshold. However, as I mentioned, there's a lot of positive signs when it comes to outmigration of smolts, right? So when adults are getting into the river, when they are spawning, their progeny are apparently doing very well in terms of hatching, surviving in the river, and moving out into the marine environment. So lots of positive signs from that standpoint. There's a question about, is there currently any fishing on the river? And the answer is no, there's still a fishing moratorium. It was supposed to expire in 2020, I think, and was extended through this year. I haven't heard yet whether it will be extended into next year.
And with that, I think I have to cut off because I just realized we're well after 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
I promised you it would be done by 9. I'm sure you have things to do in the morning.